It has been a week. I want to step back from the headlines for a moment and turn your attention to a little-known letter that was written about 235 years ago by our nation's first president, George Washington. The letter was a response to English feminist and historian Catherine Macaulay, who had written Washington congratulating him on his new role as the first head of the United States, what Washington fondly called the Great Experiment. History hasn't paid much attention to this letter, but its words are profound and timely. It offers a view of how Washington perceived his new role as president, not as a vehicle for personal power, but as a duty of stewardship. His responsibility, as he saw it, was to facilitate a social contract between the governed and their government. George Washington understood that every decision he made from that moment forward would be remembered and possibly emulated by future American presidents. He wrote to Macaulay, saying in part, quote, "In our progress toward political happiness, my station is new, and I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent. The government, though not absolutely perfect, is one of the best in the world. I always believed that an unequivocally free and equal representation of the people in the legislature, together with an efficient and responsible executive, were the great pillars on which the preservation of American freedom must depend," end quote. The great pillars on which the preservation of American freedom must depend. That's not how things are going right now. Donald Trump has been in office for less than a month. He's already attempting to cripple the federal bureaucracy and the federal agencies that were designed to serve the American people. Meanwhile, the oligarchy backing him has launched an all-out war against federal workers themselves, a retributive attack on the so-called deep state, but really an attack, by extension, on the people those nonpartisan civil servants serve. You and me. An unelected billionaire, Elon Musk, who happens to be both the richest man in the world and the current president's top campaign donor, appears to have quite literally seized control of the technical and operational infrastructure of our federal government, effectively sidelining Congress, which has the constitutionally mandated power of the purse. It's becoming increasingly apparent that what this new American oligarchy seeks to relegate Congress to is largely a ceremonial role, or perhaps no role at all. In his farewell address, Joe Biden warned of this dangerous new threat. He warned of what he called the tech-industrial complex and how it could break our democracy, what George Washington called our great experiment. He cautioned that there would be dangerous consequences if a concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people goes unchecked. It's just 3 weeks in. It's not actually too late. Across all 50 states, resistance is taking shape, despite the attempts to flood the zone with a barrage of presidential pronouncements and orders of dubious legal validity that are in large part designed to distract the media and demoralize the population, or at least that part of the population that opposes the damage that Trump and the oligarchy are doing to America. America's judges are holding the line in some cases, and people are in the streets defending the body politic that is currently under siege. This is not new for us, even in America. Americans have faced grave challenges in the past: slavery, the fight against women's suffrage, racist laws, unjust wars, the Civil War. We have never emerged from them perfectly, but usually and ultimately, we have emerged stronger, more inclusive, more democratic. The Russian dissident, opposition leader, and democracy activist Vladimir Kara-Murza knows the dangers of the growing power of the oligarchy and the toxic combination of a tech-industrial complex and an anti-democratic regime. In April of 2022, in the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Kara-Murza appeared on this show and bravely criticized Putin's government.
Are you worried about speaking out against the Russian government and against this war and invasion from Russia?
We all know the price. We all know the cost. But we also know that there are millions of people in Russia who categorically oppose Putin regime and everything it's doing. I'm a Russian politician. Russia is my country. Russia is my home. And this is where I have to be.
I'm worried for you, my friend. You have been a source of my information for many, many years, so I'll worry on your behalf.
One day later, Vladimir Kara-Murza was arrested. He spent much of the past 2 years confined to a small cell in a Siberian penal colony. He's also survived 2 poisoning attempts before that, believed to have been retaliation for his advocacy against corrupt Russian elites. Kara-Murza was released from Russian prison last August in an historic prisoner exchange between the U.S. and Russia. Now, today, he suffers from polyneuropathy, a nerve condition that affects his ability to feel his extremities, suspected to have been caused by his poisoning at the hands of the Russians. Like great opposition leaders before him, Kara-Murza's defining trait is his unwavering sense of duty to his country, at risk to himself and his family. As he explains it, quote, "What moral right do I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up and resist dictatorship if I wasn't prepared to do it myself?" End quote. Since his release, Kara-Murza has been tirelessly lobbying Western leaders to take stronger action against Putin, while also working to maintain the morale of Russia's resistance, both at home and abroad. In his latest article for The Washington Post, co-authored with fellow dissident Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Russian activist and opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and Ilya Yashin, who was also imprisoned in Russia, Kara-Murza focuses on big tech's moral failure, calling out the industry's complicity in enabling autocrats worldwide. Quote, "Every concession to dictators hides a tragedy. In Iran, administrators of opposition media platforms whose data was handed over to the government have been executed under the country's laws. In Russia, tens of millions lost access to uncensored information about Vladimir Putin's bloody war against Ukraine, leaving them vulnerable to relentless state propaganda. But do we really have a choice? Corporate Western lawyers from Western tech companies argue. To operate in a country, we must follow its laws. They see no room for debate. The principle of following local laws, no matter what they are, provides a convenient excuse. But it's just that, an excuse, an immoral dodge. We believe technology can stop being an unwitting accomplice to dictators and an easy tool for oppression," end quote. Joining me now is the intrepid Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian activist, Russian opposition politician, Washington Post Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, and a friend of our show. It always warms my heart to see you, my friend. As you know, I thought for a while there that you and I would never meet again. So I'm glad that you're here. And as you promised right after you got out of jail, you jumped right back in. This is a very specific concern we have, Vladimir, one of which you know, this tech industrial complex and its complicity with our growing autocracy in America, and we seek your advice.
Well, Annie, it's always very good to be back on your program. Thank you for the invitation. The reason we penned this article for the Washington Post is that increasingly we're seeing Western businesses, Western companies, Western tech companies essentially acting as accomplices to dictatorships, not just in Russia. This is a global trend. We see this in communist China. We see this in Arab states and other places where people have no right to freedom of expression, freedom of elections. And, you know, there used to be a time when the Western world, and that included both Western governments and Western businesses, actually helped repressed peoples in these dictatorial countries to regain their access to freedom of information. Speaking about my own country, Russia, previously the Soviet Union, you know, in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, Western countries, democratic countries, found a way to beam shortwave frequency radio signals across the Iron Curtain to reach literally millions of people inside the Soviet bloc with truthful, objective information about the crimes committed by their regimes. And this fact, this access to freedom of information was, to my mind, one of the decisive reasons for the collapse of the communist totalitarian system. And, you know, those teenagers who listened to Radio Free Europe or the BBC or the Voice of America in the 70s and early 80s were the same people who in August 1991, during the Russian Democratic Revolution, came to die at the barricades by the Moscow White House to defend democracy. Today, we're seeing the exact opposite. Yep. And the example that Yulia Navalnaya, Ilya Yashin, and I give in this Washington Post opinion piece is that if we look at Apple, an American company headquartered in California, we're seeing that not only has it not been trying to overcome the system of total censorship and propaganda imposed by Vladimir Putin's regime on millions and millions of people in Russia, which, of course, the main goal of which is to suppress and distort information about Putin's bloody and murderous war in Ukraine. Instead of helping the people of Russia access objective information, we see Apple actively aiding and abetting Putin's authoritarian regime in suppressing that information and in strengthening its censorship tools. In the past several months alone, Apple, at the request of Putin's regime, has voluntarily removed several apps belonging to independent media outlets such as Echo, The Insider, or the BBC, or actually US-funded media outlets such as Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and Current Time from its app store. And they also removed more than 50 VPN services, which allow Russian citizens to go around the sort of the blockade, the censorship wall, the internet censorship built by Putin's regime, because they say we have to comply with local laws. Well, these laws are illegitimate. These laws are repressive. You know, there were laws that prohibited Jewish people from coming into stores or that authorized the stoning of women. These are not laws.
Yes.
You know, before joining your program, Ali, I went to Apple's website just to check their mission statement. And it says that Apple is committed to respecting, and I quote, universally recognized human rights. And they actually reference UN documents such as the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights. Well, the last time I looked at that covenant, they still had Article 19, which protects and defends the freedom of expression. But unfortunately, Apple is doing the exact opposite in collusion with Vladimir Putin's regime.
And it's important to remember, in the United States, in our suffrage movement, in our civil rights movement, people were breaking laws that were unjust, which led to the furtherance of human rights in this country. In your article, you outline 3 key principles for big tech to follow. And I think it's important that you're talking about big tech more broadly, because it's easy and sometimes justified to entirely villainize Elon Musk in this, but it's tech more broadly that is involved in this. You want big tech to prioritize human rights, to consider the real world consequences of what they do, and to engage with civil society. You've distilled this into 3 simple principles. Why?
Well, because those companies that declare their adherence to principles such as the rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for democracy, they have to actually follow these principles as opposed to helping dictatorships overcome them. And this excuse that they're following, you know, so-called local laws is nothing more than an excuse, as you just quoted from our piece, because these laws are by their nature illegitimate. You know, to state the absolutely obvious, we haven't had a free and fair election in Russia in 25 years. We do not have a real parliament in Russia. It's a rubber stamp legislature made up of Putin's supporters. Putin himself is an illegitimate usurper because we have a 2-term limit in our constitution for president, just like you have in the United States. And this guy has been in power for a quarter of a century with various pseudo-legal shenanigans. But the bottom line is that it's completely illegitimate. And the 2 largest parliamentary bodies in Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the European Parliament, has actually officially recognized Putin's illegitimate usurpation of power. And then you have these Western tech companies that purport to follow, quote unquote, local laws. But this is actually a larger issue than, you're absolutely right to point out that this goes beyond an individual company or an individual person. This is a more general problem. And in fact, it goes beyond big tech. It goes beyond businesses, because we have seen in these last few weeks a complete freeze in democracy and human rights assistance programs from the United States government. And I do understand the need for review, for getting rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. Nobody's dismissing it. We've all heard of the extravagant and, ridiculous examples of how U.S. taxpayer money is spent. But, as we say in Russia, you can't treat dandruff with a guillotine. And you can't throw, baby out with the bathwater. And while there is legitimate need to get rid of waste and abuse, in my mind, it's absolutely unacceptable to just completely cut all the democracy programs, because, this year we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act that established as a principle of international law that strong linkage, inescapable linkage between democracy and security. And it's been recognized for decades by the Western world that investments in democracy, investments in human rights, this is not charity. These are not gifts. This is investment in international security, because this is the way to make our world more secure. And, you showed a few moments ago, you showed images from the Oval Office in the White House. I noticed that there's now a portrait of President Reagan in the Oval Office. Well, President Reagan, more than 4 decades ago, was the American president who established this infrastructure for the support of democracy, for the support of human rights worldwide, for the support of independent businesses and trade unions and autonomous universities, because he understood, and he spoke very often about the fact that this is not charity, that this is investment in international security, this is investment in American security. And I very much hope that once this review period that's been announced is over, we will see the United States continuing to engage in supporting democracy and human rights and rule of law around the world, because this is not only fundamentally aligned with American values, but this is actually the best investment in international peace, stability, and security that there can be.
Well said. Vladimir, stay where you are. I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to come back on the other side and continue this conversation. Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza is back with me. Vladimir, when you got arrested in 2022, I was, as you know, in Ukraine, and I was speaking to some young Ukrainians whose parents lived in Russia, and they were talking about how captured they were by the propaganda. The parents had been captured, and I said, "Can people get better information in Russia?" And they said, "Of course they can. Everybody has a VPN and can get better information." Interesting that you're talking about Apple discontinuing access to VPNs. Not that everybody chose to use one in Russia, but at least you could get them. We have also seen cases, and you mentioned it in Iran, where authoritarian regimes used big tech data to track and to punish dissidents. So the technology alone is endangering people. The technology to get access and the withdrawal of the ability of people to get access to good information.
Well, absolutely. You know, when I was first arrested in April 2022, I was placed in a cell with 5 other people. This was in Moscow, the Vodnik prison number 5. And this was just an average cross-section of people in Russia. You know, people who were there for economic crimes or for drug offenses and so on. It's by unwritten instruction. The prisons are not allowed to keep political prisoners together in the same cells. And, you know, all these other people, when I got into that cell, thought of the war in Ukraine, what they were told to think of the war in Ukraine by Putin's propaganda, because this is what they've been exposed to for years, for decades now. And I had to be very patient. I had to explain. I had to argue. I had to reason. I had to give people the facts. And, you know, after about 3 or 4 weeks, everybody else in that cell thought the same about this murderous war as I do. Not because I said anything, you know, genius or brilliant. I didn't. I just gave people the facts. And this is the key. This is the root of the problem, because, you know, most people in Russia, just like most people in other countries, are normal people. And a normal person will prefer peace to war. And a normal person will be horrified at the thought of civilians being killed and children being killed and hospitals being bombed. The problem is, however astonishing that may sound to citizens of free countries in the 21st century, a large part of the Russian population is not aware of the horrendous war crimes that are committed by the Putin regime in Ukraine, because the Putin propaganda is, needless to say, distorting and lying about everything that's going on. And I think it is incumbent on the free world. I think the free world has not only a legal, but a moral obligation, which is much more important, to reach Russian people without true and objective information about what is happening in Ukraine. And just as we've seen the freedom of expression, freedom of information being one of the major factors in the collapse of the communist dictatorship in our country, this regime, the Putin dictatorship, will also be undermined when as many Russians as possible get access to the truth. And governments and companies from democratic countries should help people get that access to the truth instead of helping dictatorships suppress it.
Vladimir, I guess we've got to do the same thing in America, though. One of your warnings in your article is that when big tech cozies up to potential autocrats or people with dictatorial instincts, that's a danger to all of us, even in a place like America.
There's a reason for the separation of powers. There's a reason for checks and balances. That is how the system is supposed to function, is supposed to operate. As you said earlier in the introduction, the United States of America has faced, well, let's put it mildly, many challenges in its history before. I'm a historian by education, as you know, but as you also pointed out, every time the U.S. came out of it stronger and more resilient in terms of its democracy. I have all the confidence in the future of democracy in America, just as I have all the confidence in the future of democracy in my own country, Russia, in the very foreseeable future. The future belongs to democracies. It does not belong to one-man, authoritarian, archaic dictatorships.
You have been saying this to me for years. You have given me many reasons to doubt that over the years, and yet I suspect you will prevail, and your view will prevail, and democracy and freedom will prevail in the world. You're actually living proof of it. The fact that you're back on this show. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian opposition politician. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning contributing columnist to the Washington Post and a good friend.